it was 1968, I'm fairly sure then. I did, you had to do primary teacher training for 2 years, and I did that at Geelong Teachers College. And then you had to get in the top 10% to apply for an extension. And I applied to do deaf teaching because I had an aunt who'd attended this school, so I'd always been interested in that part of education. I was lucky enough to get that position. And we were trained at Glendonald, upstairs at the oral school in Kew, was where we received our 1 year of specialist training. I guess signing to me came very easily. For some people there was a real block for them, but for me it came easily. So I was well placed then, I think, to sort of fit in. Yeah, she was my inspiration, and I also met other deaf people through her. People used to come, our family came from down the Western District, down near Hamilton, and my family used to try and get her friends to come and stay with her so she had someone to communicate with. I taught there for 3 years, and our principal was Mr. Green, and our vice principal was Mr. Harbison, who had been the woodwork teacher for many years here. And I can tell a funny story about Mr. Harbison because every Monday morning we'd have assembly, and of course the sign for stand up was to stand up for the children, and Mr. Harbison had chopped the top part of his second finger off at woodwork, and it was always a standing joke that when he took assembly, if the principal, Mr. Green, was away, he would take assembly, and when he said to stand up, the children would all stand on one leg, and hold up the other leg, so that was always a funny time. Mr. Green was coming to the end of his principalship at the time. He was very much against coloured stockings or fishnet stockings on the women teachers of any kind, and also the length of your skirt. And I can remember one girl coming with a skirt that he thought was too short, so he went home and he got his wife's pinny, which is an apron with a bodice as well as the other part, and she had to wear that all day till she went home and came back in something more appropriate the next day. He had a terrible aversion to desert boots for the men and duffel jackets. He just couldn't stand those sort of things, so the men weren't allowed to have those. When I started teaching down there was a men's staff room and a women's staff room, and never did they mix, except to come to the toilet. There was a toilet in the women's staff room. That was the only toilet. And I taught upstairs, and I taught a group of slow learning children with other difficulties other than their deafness in my first year. In my second 2 years, I taught the senior girls who, at that time I was 21, and most of those girls were 17, almost going on to 18, and being prepared to go out to work. Going to work was a frightening experience. I can remember Mr. Green coming up the stairs and pointing to one of the girls and saying, "You pack your things, you're going to be working in Myers and you will start tomorrow." And that was all the warning they got. That was all the preparation they got. There was a wonderful senior teacher there at the time, Carleen Merkin, and she was very concerned about the curriculum for these girls. This school was still registered as a primary state school, so there was no secondary type education. So she and I worked very hard. We had some of the brighter students did correspondence, 2 or 3 subjects of year 7 and 8 correspondence. And that led Carleen and I to work on that book that we wrote, For Young Deaf People, A Guide to Everyday Living, because that was about trying to form a curriculum that we could teach in those senior years to better prepare these children to go out to work. And that just started our work experience program, which I worked really hard about finding places and working in businesses to set up places where we could get children to get some experience. And that really is what led me to move from teaching into welfare, because Harry Powell could see the frustration I had trying to write the book, which I was passionate about, but I was also passionate about doing something about finding jobs or work experiences for these children to get better equipped to go out into the workforce. So he approached me to come on the board at that time. The girls were learning key punch. We got some key punches and had some wonderful people in BP. Down here on St Kilda Road, there was a wonderful lady who took many girls there for work experience and loved the experience of it. Myers were very good. So we started to really find, and for the boys we found other things and apprenticeships. We sort of gave them other ideas of gardening and different things that they could do and have experience with that. And in the process of doing that, of teaching them catching public transport, becoming very independent. I used to run a senior club here on a Friday night, and we'd take them out to restaurants to learn how to eat a meal or go to a show, just so that they could learn how to behave in those sort of situations. And the conditions were terrible. The heating system at the school was a boiler system, and it often broke down, so there was no heating. I can remember in the classroom in a thick woolen coat, and when I got home I'd have to get into bed with a hot water bottle and fully clothed to get myself warm. It was just horrendous, it was so cold. And the toilet, every so often the toilets used to sort of blow up. That was disaster. I mean, the conditions we worked in were really quite appalling. My job entailed writing the book, doing the work experience, working with the children's work experience. So that was a breakthrough in working up here, in linking the school to this building here. I also had the responsibility of interviewing new parents for children coming all over Victoria, coming to this school. I found that a very hard job to do, because these children were 3 in those days. They were coming down to board at PEJ at the age of 3. And I had to say to those parents, your child will have to come on an aeroplane, you will have to send them down. They might, if you can't, you know, if you don't want that, you're going to have to drive them down, you're going to pick them up, take them back, or we're going to keep them in a hostel, say for a term, not a term in those days, but they could stay up to a month and then go home for a weekend. That was horrendous for many young parents. I hated doing that. I found that very difficult. And I had come from the country, so I knew what it was like for these country parents to be coming into the city. I mean, it's a horrifying experience. Cars are rushing past, you don't know where you are. I mean, I really understood that for those parents. And I also had a lovely girl in the grade called Linda, who was an Aboriginal girl, and I loved teaching the deaf, because it didn't matter how different anyone was. They were all treated the same. You know, you could have spastic children, you could have Aboriginal children. It made no difference to them. And when I asked them if they knew any Aboriginal people, they all said no, and even Linda said no, and she was an Aboriginal girl. But they didn't see her as any different from anyone else, and I thought that was just fantastic. Harry Powell had left. Harry was the superintendent here, was his title, and it was very paternal type. Well, Harry was first the accountant, I think, and then he became the superintendent. But it was a very paternalistic sort of organisation, and Harry was very aware that things were changing. You know, it was going to be, things had to happen and not be so paternalistic. We were looking at the boarding, putting them out into the community and all those sort of things. And a woman was nominated, Kathy Massey, an American to boot. So there was a lot of feelings about, oh, a woman just couldn't possibly take a position like that, which was the best thing that happened. She had nothing to do with deaf people, so she came in from a sort of a business, I suppose, background of some kind, very well educated. And it was good for the organisation, because she really changed a lot of things. And she was one of those people, I think she was here for 5 years, but knew that she'd done her role and it was time for her to move on, because she'd changed. She got the boarding house closed up here and the children were all out into community housing. That was all during her time here. And I think it was during her time that we stopped children from the age of 3 coming and boarding at the kindergarten. Children had to be 7 before they could come, and so that's when they started providing some sort of facilities in playgroups and things in country areas. They are very connected to this particular building. That's to most deaf children, this is still home to the deaf somehow. Whether that's passed on and people tell them that, or whether it's a feeling they have, or, you know, so many parents used to say to me when the kids were leaving the place, I don't know what I'm going to do without walking through these front doors. I know when I walk through these front doors, everyone knows, or I can cry, or I can do, and people understand. When I leave these doors out and go in the outside world, nobody understands my problems. There were no women. I was the first. No, I wasn't the first woman, sorry. Mrs. Cole and Mrs. Simonson were the first women, but they didn't go on to the presidency. They were the first women. Sherry Simonson, who passed away, she was the first woman to come, and she'd been strong in the auxiliary movement. She came on, and then Mrs. Coles came on, Shirley Coles, and then I came on. So that we didn't have any women before that.